Greetings, Happy New Year. Welcome to the first Elevate podcast of 2023 entitled The Right to the Freedom from Fear. This morning's episode is rather impromptu. It's a series of musings from my morning walk this morning on our human right to be free from fear. Now, you may or may not be aware that the right to be free from fear is actually a human right enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, it was enacted in January 1941 by then American President Franklin D. Roosevelt following the World War. And whilst it had a meaning at the time of being free from fear of violent conflict and war, today I think it has a different meaning, or it could have a different meaning. But let me bring a little bit more context to this conversation. So as I was walking this morning, I was reflecting upon how crazy it has been over the last couple of years that people who have actively been pursuing truth, seeking to challenge the status quo, to find with integrity the realities of what's been happening within the COVID chapter, how those people who have fought bravely to unearth the realities of the situation in the face of real media concentration and grand narratives of fear, how certain individuals and organizations have taken the hard path, the hard and often lonely path, in order to reveal what's really happening against all the odds, and how those that have actively been seeking integrity, those that have been actively been seeking accountability, those who have actively been seeking these values of freedom have been chastised, have been censored, have been deplatformed, have been treated with aggression and hatred. And I thought to myself, what a mad world it is that those that have really put their necks on the line to try and find what's really happening, to pursue truth, are the ones that are having metaphorical sticks and stones thrown at them for this act. And I asked myself, in what world would this happen, whereby trust is given to authority blindly, whereby these grand narratives from a select group of media entities and global corporations can determine how the mass of population can see the world? And how is it that those that actively challenge those power structures are the ones that are demonized? How does this happen? And the simple answer is fear. The hard reality is, within the context of the COVID chapter, the level of fear was ramped up right from the beginning, and it was weaponized and mobilized in order to create compliance. That is very evident. But this fear has now permeated beyond the COVID chapter. And I put out a poll recently asking, how many people over Christmas found themselves surrounded by sick people over the New Year period. And that's a whole different conversation, on why people have had these enduring sicknesses. Almost everyone seems to have some sort of respiratory cough-like problem. Both of my sets of families and friends, no matter where I turned, I was bombarded with this. And it turns out that my experience is far from unique. It's very clear right now that sickness is more intense, it's longer lasting, the recovery times are longer. But the reason I say this is not to go into the reasons for this. We've spoken about this before, and the reasons are almost perfectly predictable based upon the behaviors of our citizens and leaders over the last couple of years. Nonetheless, there is still a real fear around now sickness. It's almost though, because we've had this period of lockdowns where people have been less sick on the basis that they are not circulating with others, and they're exposing themselves to less viruses, bacteria, etc. The fact that they've had almost this period of grace whereby they've been kept removed from the possibility of sickness has now led people to believe or forget what it's like to be sick. And now people are having coughs, which in the best of times can take 3 to 4 weeks, if not longer, to recover from. People are now panicking about having every single cough and splutter, and people are literally going to hospital. And this has happened. 2 members of my family have been to hospital in the last week because of their cough, and both are fine. They've been sent home just to rest, which is the normal thing to do. But I don't I don't blame them for their actions. The reality is they have been victims of this mass weaponization of fear. And now it's become a cultural norm. It's permeated our very existence. And it really, to me, surmises the extent of the problems that our culture is facing right now. The reality is this fear permeated our world leaders, and there's so many complexities to this. But it's been recognized that we live in a time where, for the last decade or so, many of the political leaders in their various forms, it doesn't matter what political leaning they come from, have generally been seeking to preserve the status quo. Now, you could always argue that politicians are, by their fundamental right, existence, are here to preserve the status quo, but it wouldn't be all encompassingly true to say that. We do know that there are political leaders throughout history that have come in and disrupted systems and, forged a new path. But it's relatively evident now that the leaders that have been dominant for the last 5 to 10 years, if not longer, have really been in this preservation of the status quo mindset, which often comes with this linear thinking. We interviewed David Murrin here on the podcast, and he talked about how many of our world leaders are now linear thinkers rather than lateral thinkers, and it's linear thinkers that maintain systems order and control, as opposed to challenging and changing and forging a different path. So we've got all of these different linear thinkers in power. And of course, linear thinkers are very control and system orientated. So where anything disrupts that system and causes chaos within the mechanism, such as a virus or fear, then where there is fear, those that are linear thinkers are more likely to be prone to acting irrationally in the face of fear. Those who are lateral thinkers, the more creative types, more visionary types, entrepreneurial types, and there is a correlation here. People have been asking themselves, why do so many buy into the narrative? And it's no surprise that those that are more lateral thinkers and those that are more creative, entrepreneurial have not been prone in the same way, not exclusively, but have not had the same fear-based response, because they're more able to deal with fear and uncertainty. People who put themselves in positions every single day where uncertainty is a factor of their life are less likely to be disrupted by something new that's fearful. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but linear thinkers are more adverse to fear. So what happens is, when you have a whole system that is based upon linear thinkers that are here to preserve the status quo, and you inject fear into the system at scale, it's really a disruptive force. And it's not surprising at all that this kind of control-based authoritarianism was a collective response to what we've witnessed. But this is just one of many problems that is highlighted by what's been happening in the last couple of years. And fear has really magnified this problem. But the reality is, the injustices and the madness, if you will, of what's happened beyond the last couple of years will, in my mind, in my view at least, not be healed until we can help people to become free from fear. Now, the hard challenge here is fear has become so pervasive, it's become so all-encompassing, that someone, when they're in fear, is they're in an emotionally charged state. They're in a heightened sense of sensitivity. Their cortisol is high, and people don't necessarily respond to rational, logical sense making when they're in a state of fear, which is very frustrating to people who are in a logical mind and they're looking sensibly at data and evidence and science, etc., around the current situation, and they're able to calmly look at that like the rock in the river and come to very different conclusions to someone who is erratically into fear, whether they're by their own admission or not. But fear will put people into this heightened state of sensitivity, emotionalized, whereby logic and reason are often futile. Trying to convince someone who's deep in fear that their fear is irrational is in itself more likely to provoke the fear to become greater and drive the grooves of irrationality even further deeper. So it's a very tricky situation, but the real pathway ahead we have to find ways to ease the collective fear that's entered into the psyche of the population. And that's challenging on the basis of what I've just shared, because we think that more information and more education will lead to a diminishment of fear, and over time it will by default. But here's where the challenge comes, is that it's further been highlighted. Again, it's a function of linear thinking, the fact that our education systems, we live in a world where you go to school, you potentially go to university, then you join the world of work, and it's this very linear system, process-driven system. We live in a world where people have become so dependent upon that system. They've become so dependent upon the handful of trusted news initiatives that people live very complex lives. We have this free-floating anxiety that Matthias Desmet talked about, and as a function of that, we now have this problem because people are not used to using their critical faculties to make sense of the world. It's a hard fact. It doesn't mean that people aren't capable. It just means that it's not a default mode of operation for most people. And again, I can empathize with that and understand that with the complexities of life. People, I'm a new father. I understand the pressures that having a family puts on you with work pressures and everything else, and this always on digital world. All of these things have contributed to the state of the planet that we find ourselves in, and the state of humanity that we find right now. And there's no real easy fix to this. There is no real easy fix. It is going to require a prolonged cultural shift in order to transform the way the world currently operates. But the good news is, as philosophers have often stated, is that during a time of crisis, it brings us to a point of reflection. It brings us to a point of questioning. It brings us to a point of evaluation, not just over our own lives, but actually of the world and the nature of the world that we find ourselves in. And more people right now are asking those questions. And more people are coming to the realizations that the way that we currently live is no longer tenable, sustainable, and change is required. And whilst this will likely lead to more turbulence as people try to figure out a path ahead, the reality is a lot of people are now seeking that path ahead. But in my view, it's essential that we find a way to restore the right to the freedom of fear, because the freedom from fear will be the thing that enables us to transcend what is currently playing out in society. And of course, we know that fear seizes upon our differences. It exaggerates them. It almost always compels society to divide along the lines of us versus them. That's happening now at scale. It's very interesting to see the ways in which that's happening. And in fact, technology is now being utilized in order to create further division. And whilst on the surface, some things, we're seeing these new platforms emerging that are enabling people to congregate with shared values. Essentially, what it's doing is creating echo chambers and silos and separating society even further. It's bringing us further away from ourselves. It's saying, I'm this type of person who values these things, and you're that type of person who values those things. Therefore, I'm not going to associate with you. I'm not going to shop with you. I'm not going to spend my time with you. I'm not going to send my kids to school. And we get this division of values. And fear will seize upon this, and it leads to this desperate situation where cracks emerge in society. And unfortunately, during these kind of periods of fear, it does entice the desperate or the frustrated and the furious. And this empowers a fundamentalism. It leads to further exploitation of the anxieties of ordinary people. It leads to this amassing of power within these kind of shock doctrines that Naomi Klein talks about, where we have disaster capitalism, where the crises are exploited by the powerful. It drives governments to make decisions that seek to preserve the law and order at the expense of freedom of dignity, which I've spoken about. And in simple terms, we can see that fear is toxic to our society because it discourages people from taking actions that may actually liberate us, enable us to heal, and enable us to forge a path ahead together. But rather than this happening, fear drives us apart. And this, again, we've seen this happening at scale. So the real challenge to us now is to restore the right to freedom from fear. And the way to do that is simple but not easy. And we have to recognize that more information is not necessarily going to be the thing that transforms people's perception of reality. It is empathizing with people's predicament, and it's recognizing the state that people are in. When people are in the depths of fear, They need love and compassion more than they need information and knowledge. And it can be challenging because this idea of us and them has quite literally driven people apart. We've seen people who are pro-narrative, anti-narrative, these terms. It's a classic example of what I've just shared, even to the point where, let's take a scientist or a medical professional like Dr. Asim Malhotra or Dr. John Campbell. Both of these medical professionals were originally in favor of the COVID mass immunizations, for instance, publicly, and they've completely U-turned on their position, which I think is a really important thing because it shows that people's paradigms can shift. But what happens is, under these conditions of fear, you see that some people are demonizing these people for their original position. And that doesn't exactly incentivize others to come forward with their changed views. So we have to embrace the fact that people will come to their own conclusions in their own time. We need to allow the space for that to happen, but to celebrate it when it does happen, because those people are the people that are going to be the ones that are the leading lights and beacons to others who previously felt the same way that they did. Because there are some people who from very early on, in January 2020, if not earlier, could see where this was heading. And, those people were seen as charlatans and renegades. I was one of them. And the hard reality is, and it's a peculiar force of nature, but if you will, the oppressors, those that create the kind of fear-mongering, those that create the tyranny, have this strange paternalistic relationship with their victims. And it's a bizarre state that people under those fear-based conditions look to those leaders for guidance and reassurance. And look how that happened. Look how, Whitty and co on the pedestal during the course of the pandemic, how they were idolized by many and seen as a source of sanctity, which is in itself a poor state of reality, that we have this deference to authority in such a way. But people look to these people who are the ones that are enacting lockdowns and stripping rights and freedoms and, perpetuating fear for certainty. So they go to the sources of authority that they previously know and trust. And the hard reality is, therefore, when other voices come in to disrupt that and challenge that, they are seen as a threat. They are seen as a threat to their comfort and certainty. And you can see how that's played out over the last couple of years. So what happens is, under these states of fear, this is the reason why people go to the hospital when they've just got a cough and just need to relax, is because they go back to the same sources of authority that actually created the fear in the first place, to get reassurance. It is this peculiar situation that we find adults in, where adults essentially are operating like children, where they are going to the parent for reassurance. I can see that now as a parent. My boy, when he's scared or afraid or he's fallen over and he wants comfort, he comes running over, arms out. It's nice. I enjoy having a hug with my kid. But when he grows up, I'll always obviously be available here for him emotionally, physically, etc. If you want to hug, you can have a hug anytime. But he has to develop a level of independence as he grows up into an adult and be able to deal with those challenges and see things and tackle these things head on as he grows up. That's a function of becoming an adult. But we're seeing this childlike behavior where people are looking to authority for that kind of paternal relationship where they get to feel safe and comforted again by those authority figures. That in itself is a dire state of where we find ourselves, in that people have become so vulnerable. But that we have to remember that vulnerability in itself is a function of the fear, but it is a function of a much deeper problem within our culture and society, and that level of independence. Where are the role models now? Look at the role models who are courageous. The courageous, independent voices are the ones that are demonized. Look back to the 80s, when I was growing up in early 90s, if you think about all the movies, and I think about some of the Western movies I used to watch, how like the horseback rider would be the bold hero taking on the villains. We don't have those role models anymore where courage is encouraged. We don't have the courage, those that seek to do things differently, those bold role models, which is why I look at what's happened with Elon Musk. And I know there's lots of mixed opinions around Elon Musk, but the reality is he's exposing the tyranny of Twitter. The Twitter files are being released week on week. You can see it, regardless of what you think his motives are. The guy is taking a hugely courageous act. And then guess what's happening? Previously, those kind of figures would be seen as the hero, and to some, he is a hero because he's taking that huge courageous act. But what's happening in our society right now is they're literally throwing rocks at him. You know, the media are causing a stir because he is disrupting the status quo. So rather than those disruptors, those courageous, independent, fiercely independent leaders who were previously revered, they are now demonized. And that shows how far we've come as a society and how things have changed. But I do think it's going to be a tipping point now, because we've had so much of this status quo for the last 10 years. And look at the result. Look at the result of maintaining the status quo. I did a presentation just before Christmas where I highlighted some of the key problems in the world at scale. We're talking macro problems. We're less healthier despite the advances in medical and scientific breakthroughs. We're less healthier than we have been. We're in rising obesity. We're less happy. We're less free. We're less democratic. We're less peaceful. You know, the world is less peaceful now than it was 10 years ago. There's more conflict. There's more division, more polarization. You look at these macro level problems, things are not exactly getting better. So maintaining the status quo is not maintaining the status quo. It's driving us. It's driving us away from ourselves, and it's driving these problems deeper. So we now do need these courageous leaders. We do need people who are willing to transcend fear. We do need people who are willing to look fear in the eyes and say, you know what, even if I'm afraid, I'm going to develop the courage anyway to transcend the current reality we're in, because we do need those courageous and bold leaders right now. And I think 2023 will see a continuance of that. We have seen this pushback, if you will, in terms of the global freedom movement, which is fantastic. But at the same time, we're seeing this now, that the cracks are emerging, as will always happen in a crisis like this, whereby we do see this new evaluation of our priorities as a society. And really, the opportunity is to shift our values. The values are the things that underpin culture, and shifting the values and our rights and preserving our rights, including the right to freedom from fear, is critical. So whilst the right to freedom of fear began in the 40s in response to the war, we can look at these major shocks to society and the world as we know it, and look to create new standards as we move forward. So whilst that right to the freedom of fear may have spoken about the fear, to be free from the fear of war, and we're not exactly free from that right now, are we, with everything that's happening in the world? But I also think right now we need a much broader sense of freedom from fear, because the use of propaganda, behavioral science, mass media narratives, these are creating pervasive levels of fear, which ultimately is exactly what's enabling this kind of tyranny, this authoritarianism, this totalitarianism to emerge. And as a result, we're seeing this pathway ahead. We've got kind of this concentration of power who are amassing power within this kind of context of fear, exploiting the vulnerabilities. And then to counterbalance that, you've also got this more wholesome, more holistic, more value-driven awakening, if you will, to what's the state of the world. And awakening is one of those kind of loose terms that's used in lots of different ways. But in my mind, it's as simple as becoming aware of the nature of the world and how it operates. And I've got a lot more to say on this. There's some amazing examples that I've come across over the Christmas period, which really highlights in practical terms just how much power is held in the hands of a very few individuals and corporations, and the influence that they have on the trajectory of our world, and how we need to disrupt that in order to decentralize and begin to alter the course of our culture. And culture, systems, institutions are simply a reflection of the attitudes, values, and behaviors of the individuals that comprise of it. So, this is where I think is the greatest opportunity, is to start making changes to our culture by changing our values and our attitudes and our beliefs about the world. And it's that the power to do that is within each of our hands. And I think it begins with removing ourselves from the state of fear. I know plenty of people who have lived their life completely free from fear when it comes to the virus the last couple of years. They've gone through it, and it's been absolutely fine. But there are others out there still are afraid. But there is a new fear emerging. There's a fear of the trajectory that we're on. There's this fear of tyranny now that has emerged, and we have to also be free from that fear of tyranny and bring ourselves back to conscious awareness and bring that back to that point of centered mindedness, where we can look at the state of the world, see it as it is, not worse than it is, and then start to see things better than they are, meaning let's have a vision for a brighter future and start to think about how we can build towards that. So I think 2023 is an exciting year. I think 2022 was kind of a bit of a mute point. It was a transitional year. There's almost like this shock effect that we've come out of this kind of COVID chapter, and there's this explosion of warfare and political turmoil and economic chaos, all of which would have been predictable realities, largely based upon the indicators of where the world was heading. You know, people who zoom out far enough can see these things way in advance. You know, even if not in specific terms, you can see the kind of trajectories are on. And I think that 2023, after that period of transition, has now created the space really to start having a more hopeful, optimistic view of the future. And I believe it starts with thinking about the culture, the nature of our society, and how we want to live. And ultimately, I think it's really important that we preserve the value of freedom. And in doing so, and in conclusion, preserving the value of freedom comes with great responsibility. And I think that responsibility is also our greatest opportunity, because I began this broadcast by talking about how I'm shocked but not surprised about how those that have acted with integrity, those that have pursued truth, those that have challenged the status quo in order to try and get to that truth, those have been chastised, they've been demonized, they've been the source of censorship, aggression. You know, it is not surprising, given everything I've spoken about. However, here's where I think the greatest opportunity is in preserving those freedoms, is that when you take the responsibility that comes with freedom, you have the opportunity to model the behaviors and attitudes of a model citizen, you know, and it's not for the corporations, the elite, to determine what the greater good is. The greater good is being hijacked. You know, who gets to define what the greater good is? You know, it's about having the opportunity to define your own moral code, your own integrity, and you know, for those people I've met in the last 2 years, those that have stood strongly in the face of tyranny to preserve freedom, those have been some of the most loving, compassionate, kind, socially conscious people I've ever met. You know, yet they've been the ones that have been labeled as anti-vaxxers, conspiracy theorists, far-right aggressors, all of these labels, you know, nonsense labels. The hard reality is, and this is the funny thing, there was an extreme left-wing publication that put out this piece. I don't want to make this political, but it's an interesting point. They put out this piece around the freedom movement and the protests and how did it amass to such a level. And I wrote to the author of this thing to say, here's my observation that you may have missed, because you're caught up in the idea that these are all far-right conspiracy theorists. I said, my experience is that the majority of people in this movement are typically more left-leaning. they're actually I call them the lost left, because you know they are of the left wing of politics that previously held the values of freedom highly, freedom of speech, and all these other values, and liberty. And it's this misinterpretation of the state of the world and the nature of things. But that's really a side note. It's not really about political leanings. It's actually about transcending that this partisanship, this divide and conquer, and actually putting aside our differences and actually recognizing the commonalities that we have amongst us. So bridges must be built. You know, how to reconnect with friends and reconcile with people is something we need to look at in 2023. But ultimately, this idea that freedom coming responsibility, if we want greater freedoms, we have to take greater responsibility. And if there's anything that stood out for me over the last couple of years is the diminishment of responsibility, you know, the deference to authority, this outside giving away our agency. And I say our in a collective term to reflect society more so than how one like you and I may act. But it's about reclaiming that agency. It's about reclaiming that responsibility. And I saw a post that shocked me last year on social media. You know, someone was aggressively attacking the idea of personal responsibility and saying that we should be, you know, we are victims of the system, and that we should spend our time blaming, you know, seeking this restorative justice, which may have some truth to it, but taking to abdicate personal responsibility for your own life circumstances and the world you find yourself in is to give away all of your agency. At the heart of finding our path free to freedom from fear is to reclaim our agency, and it's to take full personal responsibility. So I invite you to join me in rising to the challenge in 2023. Let's stand for freedom at a level that we've never stood before, but let's also take the responsibility and up-level our responsibility and agency that comes with that, and take the opportunity to take charge of our own lives and to take charge of the future that we want to create. That's the opportunity that's available to us, and I invite you to join us. So we've created somewhat of a global freedom movement over the last couple of years. If you'd like to be part of our community, you're welcome to join us over at weareelevate.org. We've built a private online community space. You can join us inside the Elevate network at weareelevate.org. It'd be a pleasure to have you there and to join our movement in 2023 as we seek to advance our freedoms, but also to make the world a bit of a brighter place in the world in the wake of all the chaos and carnage that we've experienced over the last couple of years. Have a great day. Great to see you again. Happy New Year to you. Let 2023, let the bells ring out for freedom for 2023. All right. Big love. Peace. I'll see you soon again on the Elevate.